afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cove. I'm Jim King, the former chair of the Cove board, and I'm the president of CFN Consultants Atlantic, a small consulting company here in the HRM. On behalf of Cove and BoomersPlus, our co-sponsor for this, our fifth panel discussion in our changing panel series, I want to welcome you all. We're pleased to say that we've got, looks like about 100 folks are tuned in, a little over maybe. The area of focus of this panel is on engaging senior and mid-career talent in Canada's ocean industries. Let me just say a few things about our co-sponsor BoomersPlus, who's part of this industry. BoomersPlus started in Halifax and is now Canada's source for seasoned professionals. BoomersPlus is a matchmaker, and their guiding philosophy is formed by belief in the potential of leveraging the wisdom and experience of seasoned professionals by matching them with organizations requiring their expertise for part-time projects, advisory, and mentorship roles. BoomersPlus is represented here today by one of our panelists, Rick Emberly, who will no doubt tell us more about his company as we go into the discussion. As I said, this panel is on engaging senior and mid-career talent in Canada's ocean industries. I'm delighted to be part of this because I'm kind of one of those folks. And you're going to meet a number of others across the whole spectrum. The Cove Workforce Initiative has done a lot of research in this topic, and like other researchers in the field, has highlighted the benefits of retaining experienced talent beyond what we would call the typical retirement age, as well as the benefits of recruiting older talent from similar industries where their skill sets and their expertise are easily transferable to a marine context. Research has shown us that this mature talent pool can contribute informed perspectives, experienced leadership and mentorship, as I said. They can accelerate knowledge transfer across a company, and they can often perform tasks with greater efficiency and requiring less guidance than their less experienced counterparts. So I'm joined today by four guests who will talk about their experiences in this area, in recruiting, retaining people, and indeed people who are actually doing it. This is going to be a conversation, no presentations, but I'm going to go through each of our guests individually, but we'll just pose some questions to them to get us all thinking about the issue, and then we'll see where we go from there. We'll start by looking at the research behind the issue of second careers. Then we'll see what industry is experiencing right now. And then that'll be followed by a view from someone in the transition business, in this case, the Navy, who's going to talk to us about the difficulties and the challenges in actually doing it, certainly from a naval point of view, but I think it's pretty applicable in many other areas as well. And then finally, we're going to take some time to listen to a real practitioner, someone who's actually changed mid-career, and hear what he has to say about his experience. Now, I have several Cove members working in the background here who will take your questions as we carry this out and then get them to me so that we can hopefully inject them into the discussion and respond to them. I'll introduce my guests in just a moment, but first a little housekeeping. As I said, we have over 100 folks online with us today, and we do encourage you to participate in the conversation by sending your comments and questions via the chat function. So they'll be read and they'll get the relevant ones to me, and we'll hopefully respond to them and make you part of the whole discussion. We're going to be recording this session as we do, and the YouTube link will be available later this week if you'd like to revisit or share this event with others who didn't get a chance to see it. And now let me introduce our guests. First, Tracy Mcgillivray was a senior executive in the IT industry with over 30 years of experience in global operations, business development, and account management, primarily in the private sector. She led two multinational companies to the top of the technology services industry. She's now the co-founder and CEO of a startup company based in Nova Scotia, designing devices to help seniors and others with mobility challenges remain living independently and with dignity. Rick Emberly has been a leading market communications and research expert for over 30 years. He currently heads up his own consulting business, American Associates, which he founded in 2010. In 2013, he founded boomerswork.com, operating in Atlantic Canada. This operation was rebranded as BoomersPlus.com and expanded into Ontario in late 2016. Commander Helga Budden is a naval engineering officer with 28 years of service as a seagoing marine systems engineer and naval architect. In addition to technical issues, she's well-versed in personnel and training, having served in several staff and leadership positions at Canadian Forces personnel and training-related organizations. In June 2019, she was appointed as the commanding officer, Canadian Armed Forces Transition Unit, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador. And in this role, she was responsible for managing career transition training for members leading the Canadian Armed Forces in the region. Good person to know. Finally, Jamie Sangster is the founder and the CEO of LeeWay Marine. Prior to LeeWay, Jamie served in the Royal Canadian Navy for 20 years as a marine systems engineering officer and naval architect, and has extensive sea experience in various technical and operational leadership roles. These positions include engineering officer aboard a Canadian patrol frigate and technical lead for new ship construction at Irving Shipbuilding. So a good rounded panel, I think, to address the issues that we want to look at today. So I'm going to start with Tracey Laurence and ask her about the research. What has gone on? What are the conclusions? And what is going on? And can you share, Tracey, some of your highlights from your own research about what's the untapped economic potential in Nova Scotia's older workers and potentially older entrepreneurs? What are some of your key findings, and what do you think is relevant, particularly to our industry?
Well, thanks for the question, Jim. I'd just like to start, let's do a little bit of context setting around, my layman's knowledge of the marine and the ocean-related industry. But it's a material portion of our economy that's incredibly diverse. It's export intensive, and it's truly a cross section of multiple other industries. And I think the potential to do more and drive more innovation is actually right here in Nova Scotia. And the whole concept of establishing COVE was absolutely brilliant. So my research over the last 18 months has been pretty revealing, and it certainly debunks many of the stereotypes that are out there among us. And so just a few quick points. We do decline physically as we age, our muscle mass, speed, and dexterity, but mechanization, robotization, and automation have all reduced the needs for these skills. Our short-term memory does actually decline, and we also slow down in our ability to process numbers in our heads, but our ability to interpret numbers increases. And with automation and computers, they do most of the number crunching at scale anyway. But the key is in spotting the trends, the errors, and the anomalies, and that's all about numerical interpretation. Our individual literacy levels increase with age, our cumulative knowledge increases, our communication and managerial skills improve, and our ability to empathize with others improves. So our overall ability to synthesize information increases, and we begin to exercise better judgment as we age. And it is cheaper and requires less time to train older workers, which is actually counter to a common belief. And I think the biggest reveal for me was that learning and education later in life can actually reverse any of the cognitive declines that do happen, and the brain can actually continue to improve. And that was a big reveal for me. But if you look at Nova Scotia through the lens of potential economic impact, here are some of the quick highlights. Nova Scotia ranks 7th among the 13 provinces and territories for total population and for GDP output, but it had the lowest GDP per capita in Canada in 2019. And Nova Scotia, along with New Brunswick, has the fastest aging population in the country relative to its population growth. And while Canada in total has the 3rd youngest population in the G7, Nova Scotia is more in line with Germany, which has the 3rd oldest population, right behind Japan and Italy. So is there a connection between GDP per capita and an aging population? Well, let's see if we can unpack that and answer that in the next couple of minutes. An aging labor force could potentially mean Nova Scotia employers are competing for talent in a relatively shrinking labor force, relative to the overall population, which actually can drive wages up, creating wage push inflation. So while those wages increase for those that are employed, it actually reduces the amount of capital employers can invest, which has a negative impact of slowing innovation and expansion and growth. And the corollary is that if the Nova Scotia employers are unable to hire the talent they need, they're going to fail to meet the demands for their goods and services. And a lower supply of those goods and services can drive an increase in unit pricing, which is yet another inflationary factor. And therefore, unit profits may go up, but the total revenues and aggregate profits will likely shrink. So production's negatively impacted, and there are both upstream and downstream impacts to that, which is not good. And there's individual impacts of an aging Nova Scotia population. So across the developed world, we all know people are working longer and retiring later, but they're also living significantly longer, driving the need for much larger retirement savings or nest eggs. And this has caused an actual size in registered pension defined plans and contribution plans that and earnings on those plans to the individual. And while we know our CPP will remain fully funded, it's actually only intended to provide people about 25% of our needed retirement income. So people need to work longer to accumulate the retired savings. And by the way, they're going to spend more while they work longer, which will further help our economic growth. And they'll tend to draw less from our social benefit systems. So employing older members of the labor force is a good thing all the way around at the macroeconomic, mesoeconomic, and microeconomic level. But in Nova Scotia, there's a couple of important things to note. From 2018 to 2019, Nova Scotia had the largest increase in unemployment rates in Canada. But at the same time, they posted the largest number of job vacancies and highest job vacancy rate in recent history. And yet, older workers were disproportionately laid off. And so, that's not unique to Nova Scotia. It was the same across the entire country. And so it leads you to two potential conclusions. There's either a skills mismatch between older workers and the job requirements, and or ageism is alive and well in our society. And I actually think it's a combination of both. If we brought that vacancy rate in Nova Scotia back down to a healthier level of 2%, because it's somewhere around 3.5%, it would employ, over 6,000 more people and generate $250 million more in wage earnings alone, plus the indirect and induced impacts from those increased wages, not to mention the additional tax revenues it would drive. And so I think, in my opinion, and based on my research, Nova Scotia is actually perfectly positioned to close those skill gaps. We have high quality post-secondary educational institutions, including the Nova Scotia Community College and the plethora of universities that we have. Nova Scotia is also small enough to quickly figure out what the skills are that are required and attract those older members of our labor force back to school to acquire these new skills, or attract them back to pivot to a new career where they can apply their previous experience. That experience is all valuable. And there's also a really good base upon which to build to develop these new skills, because the education levels of the 55 plus cohort in Nova Scotia are the highest they've ever been. Over the last 20 years, the numbers of those with post-secondary certificates and diplomas has quadrupled. The number of bachelor degrees has increased fivefold, and the number of folks with master's degrees has tripled. So, and remember, education can actually reverse the cognitive declines that we may otherwise suffer. So the other untapped economic opportunity is to inspire and stimulate entrepreneurialism among our older population. My research revealed multiple studies that showed the 5-year survival and growth rates of businesses started by those aged 50 and over was 70%, compared to less than 30% for their younger counterparts. So, and it's because the positive attributes and characteristics of our older labor force, those things I mentioned previously, are actually well aligned to those required of a successful entrepreneur. Yet here in Nova Scotia, and frankly across the country, the emphasis and much of the funding is actually directed towards younger entrepreneurs who have great ideas and strong technical skills, which are all essential, but they're not sufficient to drive a successful commercial venture. So this emphasis has helped stem the out-migration of youth from the province, who are also vital to economic growth. So I'm not trying to start a generational war, but the real opportunity, I think, lies in pairing older entrepreneurs with their younger counterparts, because you want to invest in and create that highest probability of success. And studies show a strong alignment in values between the older and the younger entrepreneurs. One pilot program actually that was done in Italy showed a measurable increase in both employment rates and economic output when they paired a group of older entrepreneurs with recently graduated but unemployed youth. And so that model is worth replicating. And again, I think Nova Scotia is just right for that opportunity, and it's small enough where that matching is achievable. And it's worth noting, too, that the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, who's the leader in studying entrepreneurial dynamics, showed that the older population in Nova Scotia perceives the opportunity to become an entrepreneur to be very, very low. And that's actually in stark contrast to the rest of Canada and to the youth in Nova Scotia. So we really need to change these perceptions and adjust our policies and programs and change that narrative. And I think this is even more imperative as we recover from this pandemic. And COVE has clearly seen this opportunities. The policies, the programming, and the practices actually all support the development of entrepreneurs across all generations. So I apologize for my long answer. It's just it's a fairly complex issue.
No, that's very good, and it gives us a great look at the potential, which clearly is there and was recognized at COVE. And just to focus on one of your points, I mean, COVE is, people think we're an incubator, but we're not really an incubator. We're a coordinator and a collaborator, and that's certainly fundamental to bringing people of all backgrounds together. Rick, you're in the industry. I mean, you've heard about the potential. What do you see as the actual?
Well, I guess the reality, Tracy has just done a great job of writing the introductory comments to our corporate brochure. Because it is the essence of why it is that BoomersPlus was created in the first instance. It was based on my own personal experience about transitioning out of virtually a lifelong career of 25 or 30 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of BoomersPlus is actually it's a facilitation process. It is fundamentally matchmaking. And it's built on exactly the premise that Tracy just identified, and that is that there is an ever-increasing amount of talent exiting the workforce, and it is in certain instances quite serious, and in certain industry sectors verging on a near catastrophe, and there's got to be ways to adjust it. And we think that what we've established with BoomersPlus is part of the answer, and it's only part of the answer. But what we've been doing for several years now is we've been gathering in a collection, if you like, of mostly senior folks, meaning senior in the context of the level of expertise that they've gained in their professional careers over time. So typically they are people that have held very senior management and executive level positions as they closed out their sort of careers. I hate the word retirement, and partly because I do hate it, myself along with 2 or 3 others launched the whole BoomersPlus concept in the first instance. So I'm sitting here right now and I've got 10,000 individuals sitting in a database who clamor for opportunities to do exactly the kinds of things that Tracy just referenced. Reaching out to not just startup and early stage companies, but all sorts of industries. And we've worked with not-for-profits and social enterprise organizations and so on. One of the cautions that I would throw out there based on our somewhat limited experience in the ocean sector is to be a little bit careful that we don't sort of throw up some artificial barriers and judge that industry sector in a very, very different manner than you might approach any number of other industry sectors. And what I mean by that is obviously every sector has its own unique features and aspects and things of that nature, but there's an incredible amount of commonality associated across those industry sectors as well. And a very simple example of that would be, for instance, we've often placed senior executive level people into various kinds of project and term style positions in industry sectors that they didn't grow up with, I'll say, but their expertise in many instances entirely transferable. And it extends beyond what might be their so-called professional classification or certification. So an individual who's been sitting in a CFO role in a business or in an industry sector for a number of years doesn't mean for one moment that they can transfer that expertise over into other areas. And the reason I even bring that up is because, I think that as we move forward through this conversation, it's important to recognize that the kinds of skills that reside in that so-called 55 plus, or the boomers, cohort and things like that, the demographic data is actually almost intimidating. And Tracy did a great job of highlighting some of the key aspects of it. But the fact of the matter is that technology has opened up the door and allowed for the application of skills across a broad cross-section, shall we say, of industry sectors, number one. And geography doesn't factor in it. I mean, I have people in our database right now living in BC, consulting with companies resident in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And technology allows that, So I think we have to, I wouldn't go so far as to suggest it needs to be a global perspective, but it certainly needs to be a perspective that goes beyond simply the Nova Scotia construct, I'll call it. So the first thing that I'd like to mention before we move on to the other speakers and make sure they get enough time to present their views: ageism. It's real, it's present, we encounter it constantly. And it is an inhibitor that somehow or other we have to break through. We work with it all the time. The other thing that I've already mentioned is transferable skills. They cross over all sorts of industry types and so on. And I would reinforce the fact that, our current pattern here is that when we match a skill to a particular circumstance, it's happening in timelines that are almost scary. I mean, we're putting people into positions in 10 days from the time that an organization comes to us and says, can you find us somebody expert in this such and such an area? And they're literally locked in place. And I'll end on this note for now, at least, and that is a point that that Tracy also made about the sort of intergenerational workplace. It's an often overlooked aspect of mixing and mingling, and it's particularly relevant in the startup and early stage companies of one description and another, because frankly, and for maybe obvious reasons, many of those organizations, find their energy, their early energy, and so on, with a younger cohort. And it's sometimes presumed that, oh, well, if you're working with a new startup environment of some description or another, that somebody who's 55 or 60 years old really can't bring or doesn't bring much to the table. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've got testimonials galore in our system that would prove the contrary to that. So I'll end on that note at the moment, Jim, and thanks for inviting us along, and I'm looking forward to further conversation through the presentations.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, I think certainly within the industry, many of the points that you raised are recognized, but you're right that beyond that, it's a real challenge. And, you only have to look at the makeup of the 70 plus companies at Cove that has, software designers and IT people who are sort of applicable to a whole range of activity beyond just the marine. And of course, the corollary is equally valid. So let's now go to someone who's faced with this sort of challenge from the other side. Commander Helga Budden has the challenge of taking people who are in a range of capabilities in the armed forces and then giving them an idea of how to transition into various industries such as our own. One of the big challenges in this, of course, is the recognition of credentialing and the actual jobs that people do. When I left the Navy, I went to a bunch of sort of senior executive placement agencies, I guess we call them headhunters, here in Halifax, and they all looked at me and said, yeah, well, you're an admiral, but what did you actually do? So, this is a critical issue that needs to be faced. Helga, can you address this and tell us what you do with the work you're doing daily to get this vast, sort of really capable pool of talent in the armed forces into industries such as our own.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. In terms of what we're doing as part of transition, we're part of a much bigger organization known as the Canadian Armed Forces Transition Group. And 2 years ago, December 2018, the CDS started an operation known as Operation Transition, and to do exactly what you're talking about. Our primary role is to help our ill and injured transition, and whether that's transition through recovery and rehabilitation and transition back into the service, or if their injuries are such that they cannot continue to serve, to transition in civilian life and that next chapter. And as we roll out towards final operating capability in 2024, we're taking that transition piece and extending it to all serving members. So the piece that you're talking about is part of what's being developed currently and slowly rolling out across the country. So that's going to primarily focus my comments. So as part of the rollout of Operation Transition, a lot of our resources have moved online to Canada.ca. So whether it's the businesses who are looking for folks, or our members themselves or their families, or together, they can go to Canada.ca and look into the public service and the military, and then through the links find the services and benefits for the military, and then military career transition. And so at that link, there are a number of items that will assist in helping people match up with what they might want to do in future. Part of that is the My Transition Guide, and in that, education, planning, and employment section, which goes through all of those questions that you wish someone would have answered for you on your way out, as well as many of my friends who, asked the release clerk a dozen questions and then went back to the office where 3 other mates were transitioning, and they all got different information, different packages, and compared it all together to try and put that together to find out where they were going next. Well, this process will let people do that in the comfort of their own home with those they care about. And because we have folks that transition, they may be junior in experience, but senior in life, because of course we're recruiting folks that are taking on the Canadian Armed Forces as their second or maybe even third career, or some very junior folks that have come out of high school or early post-secondary education. They can leave as early as the end of their very initial engagement, so anywhere from 3 to 12 years, or after a full career. And so with that comes technology, and there's a My Transition app that you can get for free from Google Play or the Apple Store, and you can do it from the comfort of your own phone. And as part of that translation of what our skills are as military members, no matter whether they're technical or support or the operational occupations, there is what they call MNET. I'm drawing a blank right now on what that stands for, but there is a link to it. The idea is you put in all of your qualification codes. So when you're considering a transition, doesn't mean you're ready to go. You just might be looking at what's out there for you. You put in all of the qualification codes from the training. So it's important for us to have a copy of our military personnel record. Everybody knows it as PRR. Days, that would have been your UER, your unit employment record. And you put that in, and it will tell you what the equivalencies are in the civilian world. And so that helps make those connections. We need people to go back and find all those certificates. Make sure you print them out. With some of the changing technology within the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department in general, a lot of our coursing is done online, and you can go in and get those certificates years after you've completed them if they manage to go astray in your move. As well, we're encouraging people to use their local contacts. There are a number of associations of retired or transition folks from the military, and they are incredible links. From the industry side, and business, I would suggest on this Canada.ca website with military transition, there's all a calendar that we can, the broader public can as well, that the second career assistance networks. These are facilitated by the personnel selection officers, and the dates and times for cross-country are listed. So if you're a business or an industry that's looking to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces members who are coming out with all of those skills and experience know about you, that would be the place to go. They are able to link you in with job fairs, with educational opportunities, as well as facilitate that discussion. There's also the opportunities with our local newspapers. They are still going. The Right Out here on the East Coast and Outlook on the West Coast, being able to advertise in those and let people know that you're looking for them is always a good place to go. And finally, with our transition centers, we do have return to duty, and there's a program for the ill and injured as they're getting ready if the decision is that they must transition to civilian life and cannot remain to serve. There's a vocational rehabilitation plan for serving members where a member can go and do essentially an on-the-job training or a work placement for up to 6 months prior to their transition to try it out. At which point they're still being paid by the Canadian Armed Forces, medical, dental, all of that is provided. And the industry, the employer, agrees to a certain set of terms which allows the member to go there and work free of charge and gain that experience and potentially see if it's a good fit for them. Because no matter how good it looks as a fit on paper, we all know that that's not the only bit. So that's an option out there as well to link employers and the transitioning members to make sure that it's a good fit before they go. And then I would say for both sides, we really do need to learn that common language. I'm looking with friends at different advertisements. Oftentimes, the military, we're very bad at it in terms of we use very specific terms and don't generally know what the common marine terms are for them. We just think everybody knows it and says it the way we do, and similar in other industries. And so I would suggest that, working together and making sure that we use as common a language as we can will help that translation of skills and experience be much easier. And then I just want to link in something that Rick said about that commonality. The wonderful thing with the NET program is that it does take those other qualities, the things that members learn throughout their career and experience, the organization, the leadership, the management skills that oftentimes military members don't really value as much as they do perhaps their core occupational skills. But those are key, and those are also indicated in them. And in terms of age and experience, it brings a certain perspective. And I would say that sometimes is something that transitioning military members don't really realize that they have. When you've done the type of training and been employed in places that we have been, there's a certain perspective about when the boss says there's a deadline coming up, about really how much that sort of affects, the rest of the week, whether or not it's time to light your hair on fire or not. And in addition to that, perspective can also be quite valuable and something that we don't often talk about. So I would also like to put in one point about with the VRPSM, which is for the ill and injured, but also for all serving members, we the benefit from BAC, Trans Affairs Canada, of the education and training benefit. So through the process of looking at the transition process and identifying how your skills match up with the industry or business, perhaps where you want to go to, there is an opportunity for funding for education and training post-release, being determined by the number of years served, that can assist a member, a transition member, gain those skills and perhaps other education that they need to be successful then in taking their career to that next level with that new industry or new venture. So I do know that a number of people have taken that and turned it into business and take those degrees, taking those secondary diplomas, because it's an opportunity that's second to none to allow a really good step off into the next career. So I'll end that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. That's very useful. And of course, it just emphasizes, you know, how broad this talent pool is that we have here. When you add in all the folks potentially in the Canadian Armed Forces who not only may be career types, but can follow a career path that lets them leave at sort of a mid-career point. A good example of that is Jamie Sangster. Jamie, you know, you're the quintessential Marine entrepreneur. You had a very successful naval career. You came out, you set up your own company. I mean, you're kind of the byproduct of everything we've been talking about, and a great example. Can you tell us about some of the challenges you faced and anything that you think might be useful for people contemplating that type of move?
Okay, thanks, Jim. And certainly good to be with you all. Good to see some old friends here. Yeah, I guess in many times that I've been asked this question, I've been referred to as a bit of a poster child for that transition. But I think if we do our jobs right here, we make this happen, I can move off from being the poster child and others can move in and do it. So if we're doing it right, hopefully there's others that will follow behind me and certainly move into some broader roles outside of the Navy, for example, or some other industries that they've been in for a number of years and doing a kind of a midlife transition or a midlife crisis, as I sometimes call it. The challenges for my particular transition are going to be the same as a lot of folks, I think, watching this. I think there's probably a lot of eyes on this particular panel that perhaps some are in uniform or some have been in uniform and looking for some advice on what that transition looks like. And you're not alone. I went through the same thing, and Helga, brought up a number of points and initiatives that are important in the transition and sort of help you along the way. But until you make that transition, you really you don't know what's on the other side, and so there's that uncertainty, and there's a level of unknown in terms of how much you're going to make and whether you can support your family and whether your skills are transferable, and all those are germane to the discussion. They're really important things in your life and decisions you have to make at a critical point. But I think what's really important to note is that in that transition from whether it's in uniform or whether it's in another industry, especially if we're talking about an ocean industry, what you need to know that on the other side is very, very similar to what you've seen on the former side. Okay, so one of the questions I get asked all the time is, I'm 20 or 25 years in the Navy and I'm a NESOP or I'm an operator or what have you, an engineer. Am I going to have any of the skills that some of the major employers in this industry will require? Are they going to match up? Are they, do I have enough experience? And quite often we hear, particularly with the Navy, that ships are old and technology is old. It's not. It's not old. It's very, very germane to any of the technology used in oil and gas. Now there are, some advancements, of course, but those are stepwise advancements. By and large, the industry that we're in is somewhat anachronistic, right? And it's anachronistic in the sense that the turnover of technology and the turnover of operations is very, very slow. It's multi-generational. So if you look at what we do in LeeWay, we are in many respects at the forefront of technology in terms of surveying and providing data to some of the world's leading offshore wind developers. But we do the exact same thing and we operate the ships in the same way that we did in the Navy. So if I was to take somebody that's got 35 years in the Navy as a chief engineer, and we say, right, is it applicable for that individual, for her or him to jump into a role within LeeWay or whether it's Atlantic towing? I can say without reservation the answer to that is yes. So, but I can't I can't tell you not to be worried about it. I can't tell you not to be scared about that transition. I went through it. I understand it. And, you know, getting over that hump and recognizing that this particular industry and many others are very receptive to a second career transition, because the previous years, 20 years or 25 years, have built up all those soft skills that Helga and Rick and Tracy have talked about, whether it's leadership skills, managerial skills, some of the soft skills for technology. They're all there. They're really baseline for pretty much everybody, whether you're in the Navy or whether you worked wherever else. And so you can expect those to be reasonably the same. And I think the transfer is less daunting than some of you may think. There's one other thing I'll just say about entrepreneurship and those that are considering moving over into an industry and starting your own business. I do get asked the question probably about 1,000 times of why you would do that as an entrepreneur, having been in a very structured environment for so long. And I would say 999 times before I answer this differently. I don't know. Some days I understand exactly why I made that transition, and there are a number of reasons why anybody would do that. But I think fundamentally one of the baseline rationales that anyone that's listening this will probably resonate is that as an entrepreneur, you do have the opportunity to create a bit of a culture that works for you and works best for you. And so one of the biggest advantages of becoming an entrepreneur, and there are many advantages and there are many detractions from being one, but one of the greatest advantages that you do have a lot of autonomy to create a culture that you want. And so when I look back at my career in the Navy, there were a half a dozen years that were really, really special in terms of being within a great culture and really working with a really smart team that knew what they were doing and faced challenges and got through them. And when I look at my transition, that was a big motivator. I wanted to recreate that because I knew that we excelled and it felt good and I knew what I was doing and I was confident in it. And so that transition for starting my business in 2015 was recreating that culture. And I did so with some of the team. This was not created by me. This was created by a group of like-minded individuals who also transitioned at the same time. So it was myself and there were 6 others. I happened to be the spokesman, but this was a team event, and they all had the same idea. We wanted to create a culture that we knew that we could be successful at, and so far that's worked well. So my advice really is, apart from the fear of transition and getting over that, is really about those that would like to start a business. Think about the culture. Think about back in your career where you were smart, you knew what you were doing, and there was a culture surrounding you that was really exciting and trying to recreate that.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. That's very useful. I mean, I think there always are these challenges. Certainly, being an entrepreneur is recognized by all of us, I think, particularly these days. But again, we always come back to this issue of credentialing and recognition of capability, and sometimes it's by people themselves, as Helga pointed out, the ability of their website to give people an idea of the extent to which they may be able to jump right into an industry or be more effective than they would otherwise think is very useful. So I'm going to take a question here that has come in from one of our listeners, Kumar, who's asked, for veterans from other countries, is there anywhere we can map the skills that Commander Budden just mentioned to meet Canadian business standards? I find this interesting because I've recently had a couple of clients who are from other countries who are interested, ex-service, who are interested in immigrating to Canada and seeing how they can fit in. Helga, can you give us something on that? Are we set up to accept anything? Sorry, go ahead.
We don't have anything directly to do that translation. What we do use in the Canadian Armed Forces, or what many people do when they're applying to the Canadian Armed Forces, is to look at our occupation specifications and see whether or not those specifications link up, the tasks and things link up with their previous service. But there's also the ability to use I think it's called the World Education Service. There are a number of services that take different qualifications and translate them into Canadian standards for the use of post-secondary education institutes to determine prior learning and provide credit. That might be a place to start as well. Alongside, of course, if it's engineering or technology-based or unprofessional qualification, to look to, the engineering associations within the province or the colleges that certify those particular skills. Because oftentimes they have that broader experience with other countries and with other militaries.
Thank you. I think that's useful. I would say that's a good way of approaching it, because certainly you're right. The armed forces, all of the information about occupations and the rest is all there available on the internet if you want to search it out. But we do get back to this issue, and I'll just throw this out to everyone about prior learning, about credentialing, licensing. A number of years ago, I had a client, a community college outside of Nova Scotia, and they wanted to hire a naval engineer to teach gas turbine technology. And we suddenly found out we had the perfect person from a Navy point of view, but we suddenly found out that the Department of Transport didn't recognize the qualities of naval engineers for instructional purposes. And in the years since, I found that this is widespread, and not just in the marine industries, but right across the board. I just wonder, does anyone have a good sense of, and there are organizations working on this, I'm well aware, but has anyone got a sense of how much of a problem this really is? I mean, Rick, from an industry point of view, you've got all your 10,000 candidates waiting to go. How much of that is a problem?
No, it's a recognized problem, and we would very, very regularly encounter situations in which credentialing and certification of one description and another enters into the matching process. Absolutely. Very, very often, I think the deciding or determining factor about whether or not the people that reside within our database fit with a particular need in an organization, regardless of what the nature of that organization is, does come down to whether or not they do check the boxes in terms of, their qualification, be that a formal certification, whether it's a degree-based aspect or whatever the case might be. It hasn't arisen as a serious obstacle in us finding individuals, just because as the database itself grows to the size that it currently is, and it increases every week, we're not encountering a lot of it, but it does arise with regularity. The other thing I'll just touch on very, very quickly, Jim, which is not directly related to your question, but the most active and robust part of what's going on within our operation these days and within our database is over in the area of mentoring. We've got an incredibly robust mentoring activity underway. And of course, that steps outside of the boundaries of things associated with, certification and so on. Very often, the problem with mentoring is, of course, that just because you were very, very successful in your career or your chosen profession doesn't automatically translate into you being a good mentor. So the biggest challenge that we have on the mentoring front is training. But that's a little bit off in a different subject than the point that you just raised.
Well, I didn't want to, as I slowly slip into cognitive decline here, I'm aware that I've got to keep the focus on what we're looking at. But you did mention ageism. Recognized it's an issue, it's a social issue. Presumably, it'll be overcome as we increase the success we have. But when we, as I listen to the conversation here today, I'm struck by the fact that we have this terrific talent pool, We do seem to have all sorts of outlets for it. It's just a question, I guess, of education and getting the word around to match people up. The credentialing notwithstanding.
Yeah, but our the social context for ageism is self-evident. I mean, all you got to do is track it in media, track it in the world of entertainment, and so on and so forth. And, once you hit that so-called magic age, whatever it is, 55, 60, 65, there is the presumption that your capacity to provide talent, expertise, and so on diminishes rapidly. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think it's exacerbated by a really interesting thing that we've tracked over time, that a huge proportion of people that serve in the HR field across the full spectrum of industries fall into the area of professionals between the ages of 35 and 45 years of age. And that actually magnifies the issue of ageism. They're kind of, they're looking at certain circumstances where they expect to find people like themselves. And we encounter that all the time. And the other thing I'll throw out there that might be of interest to the audience here is that, and this might be an irony, and that is that we find a lot more success in what we're doing working with relatively small and relatively newer companies as opposed to some of the biggest employers in the marketplace.
Interesting.
And that is, in fact, also somewhat driven by the issue of ageism we've discovered over the course of the last several years.
So, Tracy, if we sort of give that a wash, ageism, it's going to exist to a certain extent, but there are ways around it. What does the research show about best practices that seem to be, giving us a leg up here in getting more people to transfer mid-career or to stay on after what would be deemed a normal or typical retirement age?
Well, I just want to reflect on what Rick just said. He's absolutely right, and that the HR wall tends to be within corporations one of the largest barriers of entry for those that are over 55. You get screened out. And there was actually a study, a large study done in the U.S. where they submitted, they made up kind of resumes, if they will, to apply to, I think it was over 10,000 jobs. And on the control group, they made it obvious as to what the age was. And on the variable group, they removed any references, but just sort of otherwise made the resumes equivalent, but they removed references to age. And especially for women, the rate at which the callbacks were received, the gap was enormous with respect to the resumes where it was easily identifiable who was older, and it just reinforced what Rick said. So even getting through the initial screening process with the interview, those gaps were enormous versus when you compared the identifiable age group with the non-identifiable age cohort. And so ageism is alive and well. The other thing is when you look at and I cited it earlier, but the disproportionate number of layoffs affecting the 55 plus cohort, and that's just in those that are actually labeled as being laid off. The other part to consider is that the numbers that declare themselves retired, when you actually go unpack the retired folks, that category of folks, what you find is that people self-declare as retired rather than trying to combat, the ageism and stand up and defend themselves. So almost half of those that declare themselves as retired each year are actually, they'd sooner kind of acquiesce and use that term rather than declare no and say, I was laid off. So when you combine those numbers together, it is huge. But what that does is that actually says there's a big talent pool available of highly qualified, highly capable individuals that can step into, these job vacancies. Some may not want to keep ascending in the career and take on more and more and more responsibility. Some folks may actually want to pivot and do something a little different, and or start a business, and or be brought in to help, with a business starting. And I just think, especially in Nova Scotia, there's this huge untapped talent pool right in front of us that offers just an enormous economic opportunity.
Yeah. If I can jump in there, I think we should switch out the nomenclature here and start calling it pre-retirement, not retirement.
I hate that word.
But because it's just an ever-increasing cohort, and somehow or another, we meaning the larger, population, governments, policymakers, organizations, industry groups, we've got to figure out how to actively and aggressively engage that talent pool.
Yeah.
And, as I suggested earlier, we have just one small perspective on it in our little business, but there's dozens of other ways in which it can be activated, and it's got to be activated so people like Jamie can leapfrog their businesses forward, instead of inching them forward, because there's a ton of talent out there that can help him and hundreds like him do exactly that in the ocean sector, probably in particular.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just as a follow-up. I've got a couple of points, and I want to be, have a very frank conversation on this, because I do see this from both sides as a business owner and trying to open spaces and opportunity for people that are in the demographic that we're speaking about. It does take a concerted effort really to create an opportunity that may match the lifestyle that this particular individual would like to lead. For example, 2 or 3 a day a week, or maybe 3 or 4 weeks a year, or something like that. So it does take some initiative from the business and the employer themselves to create that. And we've done that, and very successfully in many cases, where and it works well for both our business and for the individuals. But certainly creating an environment that is conducive to the lifestyle that these particular individuals wish to lead in their second career or retired career is really important. But that comes with a bit of a proviso, because we've also found ourselves in a situation where, through no fault of anyone's, there are individuals that have perhaps 30 or 35 years experience, whether they're engineers, they have professional certifications, a first-class engineer on a Coast Guard vessel or in a naval vessel, or even an executive that would like to get 2 or 3 weeks. So it becomes a very challenging environment to negotiate how much you can afford to pay these people and how much they deserve to be paid based on their experience and credentials. And so we found ourselves in a position where, and particularly myself, in that awkward position where I am fully aware that perhaps this individual who comes with 35 years of professional experience and is used to making X per hour or X per day, they're used to doing that, but this particular role and this particular company can't afford that, right? That's a reality of it, and it becomes a bit of a cat and mouse game, not all the time, but in certain circumstances, and therefore, it does create, there needs to be some expectations set early on for both employers and employees that may be the case. Right?
Yeah, okay. If you don't mind, I'll jump on that one, Jamie, because I think it's really, really relevant to certainly what we're up to at the moment. When we were in the process of launching this business, we went out and literally surveyed a couple of thousand so-called boomers. And one of the things that we discover is as they consider so-called, post-retirement activity, employment, career, etc. Actually, money was number 3 and 4 on the list of why they wanted to stay engaged. A really, really strong sense of wanting to give back to their professions, a strong indicator related to so-called lifelong learning, and a pretty strong. I think money actually turned out in our survey in a 3rd or 4th place tie with "I got kicked out of the house." So your point is an incredibly valid one, and finding that nice balance between exactly, the entrepreneur-driven environment in which you're operating, and getting that to align with where somebody might be coming from, at that stage, shall we say, in their career, absolutely critical. But I have to tell you, we haven't had lots of bad results. I can count literally on the fingers of my hand the number of times that employers have come back to us, or organizations have come back to us after working with somebody that they've found in our database and said, gee, that didn't really work out all that well, and so on. Literally, it's a handful, but it does take effort and a conscious effort on the part of the entrepreneur and an individual such as yourself.
Rick, thanks for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I have to say, what a positive discussion. Starting off with Tracy's look at the research, which is always critically important. We're very, very sort of cognizant of that here at Cove, and then looking at the experience of industry, the Navy, and Jamie's personal experience. It's just a matter of keeping on a couple of those challenges that we identified. And I think most of all, hoping that the people listening to this will get the word around that, there's lots of potential here for people at the mid-career or the so-called end of career time to look abroad and see what other opportunities are there. So a huge thank you to our guests for giving their time and bringing their expertise to the discussion today. Another thank you to the staff here at Cove who make all this possible. And again, thanks to BoomersPlus, our co-sponsor, in bringing this, the fifth of our Changing Tides conversations, to you. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very